Professor Kidd is Associate Professor of History at Baylor University in Texas, teaching courses on colonial America, the American Revolution, and American religious history. He is a senior fellow at the Institute for Studies of Religion and is also an accomplished author. His book, God of Liberty, A Religious History of the American Revolution, was published in 2010 by Basic Books, and another, American Christians and Islam, was published in 2008 by Princeton University Press. Other books entitled The Great Awakening, The Roots of Evangelical Christianity in Colonial America, published in 2007, and The Great Awakening, A Brief History with Documents, published also in 2007, delve deeply into the history of evangelicalism in America. Most recently, Dr. Kidd has produced a work that has special resonance for this college. He's produced a work about our namesake, Patrick Henry, a biography, published also by Basic Books. How do you fit all that writing in and your teaching? It's a mystery to me, but we're impressed. Professor Kidd began teaching at Baylor and writing, apparently, as well, at Baylor in 2002 after completing a PhD in history at the University of Notre Dame, which is also my doctoral alma mater. He received a BA and MA at Clemson University. He and his wife Ruby live in Woodway, Texas, and have two sons, Jonathan and Joshua. So please extend a warm welcome to Dr. Thomas Kidd.
Well, thank you very much, and it's great to be back at Patrick Henry and see some familiar faces. I should add, given my context, I did not say this part at the National Archives today, but we're homeschooling our children, Jonathan and Josh, and they're 8 and 7. And I don't look for reasons to be away from them, but when Patrick Henry College and the National Archives call, I can make a quick trip away from Woodway, Texas. So I'm delighted to be here with you all again. I do want to talk to you tonight about Patrick Henry and my biography of him that has just come out. Patrick Henry is an unusual case among the major founders in that there is one thing that many Americans know about Patrick Henry, which is, of course, the liberty or death speech. If you grew up in Virginia, you may also know that he was the first governor of Virginia. And beyond that, people don't know much about Patrick Henry. And of course, part of that issue is that Americans just generally don't know much about history at all. But I think that there's also a peculiar issue with Patrick Henry, and the reason why people don't know as much about his life story as they do, say, about Jefferson or Washington. And I think that is because on at least two major issues of the Revolutionary era, and in particular the post-Revolutionary era, Patrick Henry ended up standing against Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And the two issues I'm referring to were the role of religion in public life, and then also, probably more importantly in American popular memory, he stood against the adoption of the Constitution. And standing against James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, I think these days in America would seem like you were standing against American history itself. And so I think that the conventional American pop memory of Henry is that he stands up in 1775 and says, "Give me liberty or give me death," and then he goes away. The great patriot has his line, and that's pretty much his role. I think there's a lot more to say about Patrick Henry than all that, and I actually think that there are at least explicable things to say about his support for direct tax support for churches, on which he opposed Jefferson and Madison, and then also, more controversially, I think there's something to be said for his opposition to the Constitution. So these are some of the issues I want to talk to you about tonight. But just so we're all on the same page, and in case your memory is not fresh even about the liberty or death speech, let me give you some context about what was going on at that most famous point in Henry's life. This was an address that was given to the Virginia Convention in March of 1775, the Virginia Convention of Patriots that are deliberating resistance against Britain and whether they should continue petitioning the Crown for relief from the various British tax policies and other more onerous policies that the British have put on the Americans, or whether they should begin to prepare for war. The more reserved members of the Virginia Convention were saying, no, we need to keep asking for relief. We need to keep asking for compromise. And Henry had been involved in the resistance movement for 10 years. From the very beginning of his legislative career, he had been in the front of the line calling for resistance against British policies. And he thought by March 1775 that to keep asking for relief was just pointless. He and many American colonists believed that within weeks that a British invasion would begin and they would begin rounding up and arresting Patriot leaders. And in fact, they were correct. It's in April the next month that the battles of Lexington and Concord had come in Massachusetts. And so they're correct. War is near inevitable at this point. And Henry says it is time for us to prepare to defend ourselves against the formidable British military. And so Henry, in a relatively brief speech to call on the Virginia Convention to vote for preparation for war, at the most dramatic moment of the speech, he says, quote, "We must fight. I repeat it, sir, we must fight. An appeal to arms and to the God of hosts is all that is left us. Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God." And with this, Henry raised his arms and bellowed, "I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." And this did turn the debate at the Virginia Convention, and they agreed it was time to prepare for war. In any case, many Americans know, or at least have heard of, the liberty or death speech, but they don't know much else about Henry. Is this because Henry really wasn't that important of a founder? I don't think so. I think Henry should be considered in the first rank easily of the founding fathers, among, say, the 6 or 7 most influential, and certainly in his leadership in the resistance movement. I think he should be considered what I call him in the subtitle of my biography, the first among patriots. Not because he is the most influential patriot, but because from 1765 and even earlier, Henry is always there in Virginia, seemingly realizing the consequences of British policy and British actions, that these are a threat to American liberty. And he seems to always be the one to see what's coming down the road before anyone else. And so I think he definitely should be considered in the first rank of American founders. Even Thomas Jefferson, a man who would later come to detest Patrick Henry personally in the late stages of the Revolution, even Thomas Jefferson said that Henry was, quote, "the man who gave the first impulse to the ball of revolution." And Henry, believe me, said this grudgingly about Henry. He didn't like him very much at all. And yet he conceded that he was the man who sort of got things going. And so I think he should certainly be regarded that way, but on these two major issues of the Revolutionary era, religion and the Constitution, Henry took on Madison and Jefferson. And so I think that many Americans, if they know about that side of Henry's legacy, they think it's peculiar or perplexing. What went wrong with Patrick Henry in the 1780s? Again, I think that there's a logic to both of these positions that he takes, and so I want to talk to you about that tonight. Let me first give you some idea of Henry's background and how he became the first among patriots. Henry grew up on a farm in Hanover County, Virginia, just north of Richmond, and I think that his parents' chief aspiration for him was probably to be a farmer. This was a lot of most Virginia boys in the 1740s and 50s. He had almost no formal education outside of the home at all. He went to a little grammar school for maybe a couple of years before the age of 10. And from that point forward, he was schooled exclusively by his mother and father at home. And obviously this is part of Patrick Henry College's connection with Patrick Henry, is that if he was around today, he would be considered a homeschooler. Of course, his kind of homeschooling is very different from our sort of homeschooling. I mean, back in those days, it was not unusual for people like Henry, like George Washington, like John Marshall, even later on, Abraham Lincoln, people like this, to basically be schooled exclusively at home. There just wasn't an elaborate public school system for them to go to. I do think that Henry's schooling at home, though, was probably reminiscent of the kind of homeschooling that we have today. The sort of aspirations that his parents had for him, I think, were similar to what many homeschoolers have for their children today. Henry was very deeply versed in the great text of Western civilization, Greek and Roman antiquity, the history of Britain, the history of the Reformation, many of the classic texts of history and literature, and of course the Bible. We can't forget about the Bible. Henry, like so many people of his time, was very, very deeply conversant with the Bible. Henry was also a serious Christian himself and had much of the Bible available in his memory to be quoted at will, and he often did in his great speeches. And so his parents, even though their aspirations for him, I think, were vocationally rather modest, and he started out with the idea that he was going to be a farmer, they believed that this kind of liberal arts education was absolutely indispensable for Henry to become an educated adult and to be able to participate in Virginia civil society. He needed to know about these things. So I think in that sense, his home education was reminiscent of much of our home education today. In any case, Henry wasn't a very good farmer. He didn't much like farming. He didn't find that this was his sort of career calling, and so he began trying to explore other venues. He opened a couple of businesses, small shops in Hanover County, and both of them failed rather quickly. They got into debt, and he gave out too many loans to the local farmers and so forth, and he ran out of money and had to close the shop 2 times in a row. On his farm, one of his early farmhouses burned to the ground, and he ended up living with his wife in an overseer's shack on the far distant reaches of his property, and he was really struggling. He was a man who was familiar with failure, abject failure personally, which I actually find sort of inspiring about Patrick Henry, is that it didn't come easy for him. Actually, when he and Thomas Jefferson met for the first time, Patrick Henry was a bartender. He was working part-time as a bartender at his father-in-law's tavern in Hanover. And I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but the Hanover Tavern still, it's almost entirely modern construction, but the Hanover Tavern is still there in Hanover, Virginia, right across the street from the Hanover Courthouse, which is where Henry practiced a lot of his law. And so if you can imagine, he meets Jefferson, who is on his way to William and Mary, and Jefferson is a relatively more ambitious young man, and I think has his future direction figured out a little earlier than Patrick Henry. Henry has a young family, and there he is pouring drinks at the Hanover Tavern, and he thinks, I got to do something else here. I got to figure out what I'm going to do. And so Henry decides, improbably to our view, that he's going to be a lawyer. In those days in Virginia, there were no law schools, although it wasn't that unusual to go to William and Mary and train for the law, but he was not going to go to college, and so Henry decided to train himself to pass the bar exam. There's some controversy about how long this took Henry. Jefferson later on, I think in a fit of envy, said that it took Henry 6 weeks to prepare for the bar exam. I think it was longer than that. I think it was probably more like 8 or 9 months, which still doesn't seem like very long when you're training yourself to do it. But in any case, Henry began reading what he needed to read in the law books and so forth, and went off to Williamsburg in 1760 to face a rather formidable legal examining committee. And when he had his interview with them, they said, Mr. Henry, you don't understand the laws of our colony very well, sir. You don't understand enough about contemporary law. Boy, you know a lot about history and political philosophy. And so we think we'll let you pass. You better bulk up on contemporary law, though, son. And so they gave him his law license, and he began to practice as a country lawyer, mostly in Hanover County and surrounding area, and began to develop a pretty popular practice. He first burst onto the colony-wide scene in a case in 1763 that maybe some of you are familiar with, the Parsons Cause. This was a case where in the late 1750s, the colony of Virginia cut the salaries of the state-employed Anglican ministers. Now, this is instructive, I think, that when we talk about Virginia or England having an established church, this means that ministers and parsons were on the state payroll, right? And so they were being paid, and the normal way of paying them was in tobacco leaf, right? I mean, this was currency in colonial Virginia, right? Is that state employees got paid with tobacco leaf, and then could sell it at market or, you know, smoke it or whatever you wanted to do with it. But in any case, that's what you got paid in, was tobacco. And they got their salary cut, and they gave them a cash substitute instead, which was functionally a pay cut. The Parsons did not like this. People don't like having their pay cut. And so some of the Parsons got together and appealed to the Privy Council in London to have this law overturned. And the Privy Council approved their appeal. And with the King's blessing, what was called the Twopenny Act, which reduced their salaries, was overturned. Some of the Parsons began suing in Virginia county courts to recoup lost salary. And Patrick Henry ended up defending Hanover County in 1763 against one of the lawsuits by the Parsons to recoup lost salary. And this was a case in which there were legal technicalities about whether this person deserved their back salary and so forth. But Henry, as was always his wont, escalated the issues to the very highest level. And it turned out to be an incredibly dramatic show at the Hanover County Courthouse. It's a strange scene in some ways because, among other things, Henry's father was the judge in the case. If you can imagine, you know, I mean, this is colonial law, right? Here's John Henry, you know, and so, you know, he's hearing the case, and his son is, you know, gesticulating and so forth. And when Henry really gets wound up appealing to the jury, in the famous line of this argument in the case, Henry begins to address the king's role in this, and he says, "A king, by annulling or disallowing laws of this salutary nature, like the Twopenny Act, from being the father of his people, degenerates into a tyrant and forfeits all right to his subjects' obedience." You know, this is 1763, right? I mean, you know, we haven't had the Stamp Act yet, right? I mean, nobody's calling on resistance or anything like this. But here is Patrick Henry, young whippersnapper lawyer, saying that if the king reserves the right to overturn perfectly reasonable laws passed by our own assembly, then this is not going to work long term. People in the audience were horrified and began to mutter, "Treason, sir, you speak treason," which seems to be the reaction that Henry gets to most of his major speeches. "Treason, sir, you speak treason." And so Henry has to back off on this sort of thing. But he convinces the jury. By the points of the law, it is clear that this parson deserves to be, get a favorable decision. But the jury is so disgusted with the parson's lawsuit that they decide to award him 1 penny in damages to insult him. And so Henry really functionally wins the case. The Parsons Cause catapults Henry into some local celebrity, and he ends up being elected in 1765 to Virginia's House of Burgesses, the colonial legislature. He enters the House in May of 1765, just as Virginia and the other colonies are getting news of the passage of the Stamp Act. And Henry takes the lead in opposing the Stamp Act. He's not shy, as you would imagine by now, about leading the resistance in Virginia. He doesn't care that he's a freshman legislator. He gets right out front, leading the initiative, and he's the one who pens Virginia's resolves against the Stamp Act, which they pass. It's a strange situation. Again, doing history of this time period, you only know what is documented in the historical records. Northern newspapers report that there are 7 resolves that Henry writes against the Stamp Act. We only actually know of 5 for sure. There are only 5 in Henry's records and the records of the Burgesses, but the Northern newspapers print 7. And the 6th and 7th are utterly revolutionary. I mean, they're calling for open civil disobedience against the British and not complying with British law anymore and so forth. I don't think that Henry wrote those, but somehow they get reported as, you know, and I think the Burgesses are, we passed what? We didn't pass that. Anyway, we know 1 through 5 are written by Henry, and those shaped the colony's debate. You know, this humble freshman legislator, 29 years old, shapes the whole colony's debates about the resistance to the Stamp Act. Again, Henry gives an incendiary speech on the floor of the Burgesses about the Stamp Act. Famous line here is that Henry says, in light of the Stamp Act, that Julius Caesar had his Brutus and Charles I had his Cromwell. And similarly, Henry did not doubt, but that some good American would stand up in favor of his country if the king persisted in passing these kinds of laws. I think you see the implication here. He's hinting that the king should be assassinated, right? And so, again, treason, sir. You speak treason, right? Now, the mythical line at this point has Henry saying, maybe some of you have heard this, the second most famous line ever from Patrick Henry, "If this be treason, make the most of it." Anybody ever heard this line? Sorry, Patrick Henry did not say that. That is a myth that I think we can falsify. There is one eyewitness account of the speech from that day who said that, that Henry sort of apologized for his rash words, which he attributed to his fear for, quote, his country's dying liberty. And he sort of said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, I probably shouldn't have said that, but you have to understand how passionate I am about American liberty." And this is the way Jefferson recalled it later, too. The myth makers somehow heard that and got rumors of that, and then it made it into the later biographies. I don't think Henry said that, because I think if he had persisted in saying this, he probably would have been arrested, and I don't think Henry wanted to get arrested. But he had gotten his point on the record, and then sort of artfully retracted his statement for calling for the king's assassination, which is a pretty rough thing to say, after all. And in any case, here he is, again, first among patriots, calling for resistance before anyone else. And then, of course, there's the Liberty of Death speech in 1775. This turns the debate in Virginia towards military tactics and resistance. And the Virginia Convention accepted Henry's argument of turning towards military preparation, but they also decided immediately when they voted to begin to raise arms that they would make Patrick Henry himself the commander-in-chief of Virginia's armed forces. The tone here, I think, is, well, Mr. Henry, you've asked for this. Now here you can lead the militia. The problem with this is that Patrick Henry had absolutely no military experience whatsoever. All he had done is said liberty or death, right? And so they gave him in charge of put him in charge of the Virginia military. You may ask, well, where's Washington? Washington's off in Massachusetts, getting ready to head the Continental Army. And so Henry ends up being sort of the next best choice. That experiment lasted about 6 months. And Henry, he actually wasn't terrible as a military commander, but I think everybody kind of realized, oh, well, he should be back in political leadership, not military leadership. And so that was kind of the end of that experiment. And then, of course, he became, when Virginia declared independence, he became Virginia's first governor and was the governor of Virginia, and easily the most influential political leader within Virginia during the Revolution, the most populous state at the time, probably the key state in the revolutionary movement. So that's Henry's background and how he ends up becoming this key leader in the revolutionary movement. Now, I want to move for the rest of my talk to these issues about Henry's faith and his view of the public role of religion, and then finally the Constitution. Henry, among the major founders, is the most serious, outspoken Christian. This accounts partly for my own interest in Henry. There's really no question about the seriousness of Henry's faith, and so what does it look like for someone like him to participate in the Revolution and then later on his opposition to the Constitution and so forth. His parents were serious Anglicans. His father was a vestryman in the Anglican Church, important lay leader position in the Anglican Church. But as a boy, Henry's mother got involved with the Great Awakening of the 1740s. And she began to take Henry to Presbyterian revival meetings, even though they were Anglicans. She would take him to the Presbyterian revival meetings led by Pastor Samuel Davies. And you can still go. I was just there in November at the Pole Green Church, where they have a framework of Davies' old church down in Hanover County. And these were the beginnings of the Great Awakening in Virginia in the late 1740s. And Henry's mother would take Henry and his siblings to these revival meetings, and as the story goes, she would make young Henry repeat the biblical text and the essence of the sermon to her on the wagon ride home. You know, homeschoolers, right? And I think this had a really deep influence on Patrick Henry in his faith, which I think was serious and abiding, and more serious, I think, as his life went on. And even though he never left the Anglican Church, I think he was very sympathetic to evangelical revivalism. And later on, he said that Samuel Davies was the greatest orator that he ever heard. And coming from the man that was, by all accounts, the most influential orator of the American Revolution, I think that's quite a compliment. And I think he learned some of that speaking technique and style from the revivalist pastors of the Great Awakening, most notably in the master class of Samuel Davies. Later on in the revolutionary times, people would say that Henry himself spoke like a preacher. You know, that Patrick Henry, he thinks he's a preacher or something, the way he talks. These were his critics would say this, and it's true. I think that Henry, you know, wouldn't engage much in highbrow political theory, and so, you know, he's not citing Montesquieu and so forth in his great speeches. No, he was appealing both to the mind and to the heart, to the fundamental principles in the language simply of the Bible. Often, when you look at the liberty or death speech, people have broken down the liberty or death speech. It's not a very long speech in print, about 4 pages. It is shot through with references to the Bible, direct quotes from the Bible, but people didn't notice that for the better part of 200 years because we're so comparably biblically illiterate to what they were in 1775. So if he was given the speech today as a politician, he would have to say, as the good book says, or as the prophet Jeremiah says, because the most common source he's quoting in the liberty or death speech is Jeremiah. But if you can imagine them sitting there at St. John's Church in Richmond in the Virginia Convention, he would cite Jeremiah, just a phrase, without attribution, and the crowd would say, oh yeah, Jeremiah, right. Even more obscure passages, yeah, Jeremiah, right, got it. They know the Bible when they hear it. So I think it's the style of the revivalists, but it's also the content of their message and the deep biblicism of the time that influences him as a speaker. He's also very much an advocate for the rights of religious dissenters. He gets to know the Presbyterian and Baptist dissenters of the Great Awakening and is very much sympathetic to their plight. The Baptists in particular are very badly persecuted by the established Anglican Church and their state authorities. In the 1760s and 70s, there are a number of Baptist preachers who were put in jail for illegal preaching on the eve of the Revolution. They won't get the requisite licenses to preach and so forth. And so 30-some Baptist preachers are put in jail on the eve of the Revolution in Virginia. And Henry finds this to be despicable. There are accounts, probably some legendary, some factual, of Henry defending these dissenters in court and maybe even paying bail for some of them to get out of jail. I can't document that, but I think it's likely that things like that were going on. He and Madison worked together on the 16th article of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which, among other things, guarantees Virginians that famous phrase, the free exercise of religion. And so he says, our government needs to get out of the business of persecuting people for their religious beliefs. But here's the thing, is that Henry did not believe that religious liberty conflicts with government support for religion. Okay? And that's where he and Jefferson and Madison come to blows over the issue of religion in public life. In the 1770s, and at the beginning of the American Revolution, Virginia defunded the Anglican Church, not as an act of disestablishment or saying we're not going to have an official church anymore, but because they don't have any money, right? And so they need to fund the war, right? And so we don't have money for the church right now. And the Anglican Church badly suffered during the war. I mean, they're really destitute. Like so many churches, they struggle badly during the war. So at the end of the war, Patrick Henry and the Friends of the Established Church say, well, look, religion is really important. If you're going to have a republic, you have to have vital religion. You have to have virtue in a republic for the republic to survive. You have to have public spiritedness among the people. The government can't make people virtuous. What's the best agency for making people virtuous in the republic? You don't have to invent something. We have the churches. So let's directly fund and support the churches. And we also have to remember that the churches are the chief agencies of what we would today call welfare and also education in a time where there's effectively no public education, no system of public welfare. The churches handled most of the responsibility on those fronts. So we've got to support the churches for these things. So Henry, being aware that Virginia is now a very pluralistic state with regard to religion, Christian pluralism, right? He says what we need to do now is to have a system called what he called the General Assessment for Religion, in which, like they had always done from time immemorial, they would require people to give taxes to support a church, but you could choose the designee of your tax funds. So it could be the Anglican Church, but it could also be Presbyterian, Baptist, Quaker, or whatever you want. And if for the very, very small number of non-Christians in the state, they could be exempt from the tax. So this is a kind of a hybrid model of recognizing the Christian pluralism in the state, that the Anglican Church is not the only game in town anymore, but we have to support religion. Madison and Jefferson are promoting Jefferson's bill for establishing religious freedom, which says not only will there be free exercise of religion and no more persecution of dissenters, but the government will no longer give any direct tax support to churches as churches. Okay? Now here's the trick. The evangelicals in the state, especially Baptists, support Madison and Jefferson because they have fresh memories of being persecuted by the official state denomination. And they think if the government gets involved in religion, religion gets corrupted. And they say, give us, in effect, a free market of religion, and we will beat the Anglicans for adherence. Let's just get the government out of this entirely and have religion be on a totally voluntary basis, and it will be stronger. Henry's argument is if we directly support religion, it will be stronger. The evangelicals, Madison and Jefferson, say if we get the government out of the business of religion, religion will be stronger. There is no secularist position in this debate. There's no pro-religion versus anti-religion. It's a debate about the basis on which religion will be strongest. Madison and Jefferson win the argument with the support of tens of thousands of evangelicals in the state. A pretty high percentage of the whole population of the state sent petitions to the legislature calling on the legislature to go with Madison and Jefferson's system, and lots of these people are evangelicals of one sort or another. They win, and disestablishment in 1786 is followed up fairly quickly by the advent of the Second Great Awakening in Virginia and the rest of the country, which is the greatest era of Christian growth in American history. So on that point, I think that the Baptists are right, that getting the government out of the business of promoting denominations is probably the best way to go. But we have to remember that Henry is no outlier on this issue. About half of the major founders believe in direct government support for religion. George Washington believes in that. John Adams believes in that. Patrick Henry believes in that. So it's not an obscure or weird position for him to take. It is the traditional position, and it makes a lot of sense. Okay. This debate built into a growing rift between Jefferson and Henry. And Jefferson came very much to dislike Patrick Henry in the 1780s. And this is just an interesting side note to realize that these are real people. They're not just saints floating around on a cloud somewhere. To put this in a nutshell, Jefferson was the governor of Virginia in early 1781 when Virginia was invaded by the British with the turncoat Benedict Arnold at the lead of the British Army. Jefferson and the Virginia government began fleeing into the West and almost not escaping the Arnold's army. Jefferson's term as governor of Virginia was almost up. He had about 4 days left in his term. They almost captured him in Charlottesville, him in the state legislature. And Jefferson inexplicably resigned as governor and told the legislature as they kept fleeing into the West, find somebody else to be governor, I'm done. And he took off for Poplar Forest, his plantation to the south. The legislators were horrified, and as was Henry. Henry initiated an investigation into Jefferson's behavior as governor, and Jefferson never forgave him for it. The investigation didn't play out because Yorktown went down and they sort of said, well, we don't need to dredge all that up anymore. You know, the war's over. But Jefferson really detested Henry from that point on. So much so that, Madison, when Jefferson goes off to Paris, Madison is always writing to him and saying, you're not going to believe what Patrick Henry is up to now. This intolerable person. We can't get anything done politically because of Patrick Henry. And at one point in 1783, Jefferson writes to Madison back from Paris. And Jefferson says to Madison in this letter, he said that they needed to take their opposition to Henry to a higher authority. He said, quote, what we have to do, I think, Jefferson writes to Madison, is to devoutly pray for Mr. Henry's death. Now, I think Jefferson is joking, right? And I also am not sure that Jefferson believed in prayer. But he does write this in an encrypted code, right, that they would use to write to one another so that no one else would see this, that he had said this about Henry. So he really, really didn't like Patrick Henry. And I think Henry was more of a political issue. I don't think Henry carried grudges the way that Jefferson did. The last issue is Henry's opposition to the Constitution. This, I think, many Americans do find inexplicable. I mean, we revere the Constitution, and certainly at places like Patrick Henry College, we revere and respect the Constitution and what it accomplished. And there was deep dysfunction in American politics in the mid-1780s, especially as regarded trade and economic policy. The Articles of Confederation, our first American Constitution, was a very state-based confederacy. And so it was very difficult to craft nimble, effective national policy on trade and economic issues. This was a real serious problem. The Articles of Confederation did have some serious successes. Most notably, under the Articles of Confederation, America defeated the British military in the American Revolution. That is a pretty serious accomplishment, right? So this business about the Articles of Confederation was just pathetic, and it didn't, that's not true. But there were serious problems. And so there's a debate in the 1780s about whether we should, in effect, start all over again and create a whole new constitution, because the Articles was almost impossible to amend. It required unanimous consent of the states. And, Rhode Island was always fouling things up. You go to North Carolina or something, you couldn't, there would always be the one state that would hold things up. So people like Madison, like Alexander Hamilton, start saying, we need to just start over afresh. Henry believed that, Henry had been twice, again, Virginia governor in the 1780s and had some real problems with Articles Congress. There were episodes in which I don't want to go into the details, but the Articles Congress showed a willingness by the Northern congressmen to take actions that everybody knew were directly contrary to Southern economic interests. In particular, they tried to negotiate away the rights to navigate the Mississippi River. And if there was not a rule for a supermajority in the Articles Congress for these kind of treaties, they would have done it, even though all the Southern congressmen, Southern governors, knew that this would be a disaster for the Southern economic future. Henry said, so we're going to give this government more power over the states. Right. I don't think this is a good idea. And plus, Henry said, look, what was the American Revolution about? Was the revolution not about a revolution against strong centralized national government power, and in particular, the power of that national government to tax the colonists? The Articles of Confederation government did not give the National Congress the authority to tax Americans. Only the states could tax. And now Madison and Hamilton eagerly wish to give the National Congress back the right to tax Americans. Henry was not excited about that prospect. And he said, I think if we give the national government this much power, it will eventually become a monster. Maybe it'll work for a while. Maybe if we have well-intentioned people in control. But ultimately, it will become a monstrosity. It will burst all bounds of size and scope. It will tax the American people to death. It will raise up unbelievable rates of debt. Anybody see what I'm getting at here? He forecast that there would be problems eventually if we adopted this Constitution. Maybe not because of the Constitution, but because of human nature. And Henry says at the ratifying convention in 1788 in Richmond, he says maybe this would go well if people were naturally good. But he says, and this is a direct quote, the depraved nature of man is well known. And so you have to have a framework of government that keeps people from aggrandizing their power and centralizing power and taking over the power of states and localities. This is a mistake. This is a betrayal of what the Revolution was about. Now, we don't have to agree with Patrick Henry. We don't have to go along with the very strong minority of delegates to the Virginia Ratifying Convention who voted against the adoption of the Constitution. We could say that we would still cast a vote for ratifying the Constitution, but we can still understand Henry's concerns and to see that his forecasts, I think, have substantially come to pass. And if Henry was alive today, I think he would, if he was in a bad mood, he would tell us, I told you so. You got what you deserved. Much to Henry's credit, he did reconcile with the new government. He didn't take his toys and go home. But this is mostly because his longtime friend George Washington was elected president. They were very close allies. And so Henry thought, well, okay, if George Washington will be president, that'll be all right. If he had lived to see Thomas Jefferson elected president, I think he would not have liked that so much. Henry stayed out of politics for most of the 1790s, despite attempts over and over and over again to get him to come back into politics. He was offered every conceivable position to be a member of the U.S. Senate, to be an ambassador to Spain, to be Secretary of State, to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and then finally in 1796, through an intermediary, Alexander Hamilton approached him about running for president. And Henry says, I don't want to be president. I want to be with my family and live my private life at Red Hill, you know. And he's an aging man, but he still has young children. He had a total of 19 children between his two marriages. His first wife died, unfortunately, at an early age, and he had two marriages with 19 children. And so there are scenes in the 1790s of him romping around with his young children at Red Hill. So he stays out until 1799, when Washington directly appeals to him to, will you at least run for the Virginia legislature again? You won't have to travel far. And Henry says, okay, I can't decline a Washington, personal request from Washington. And so he runs and is elected once again to the Virginia legislature, but he dies before taking office in the summer of 1799, preceding George Washington in death by about 6 months. And in his will, you may know this line, but I think it's fitting to conclude on this note. He wrote of his bequests, he said that, quote, this is all the inheritance I can give to my dear family. The religion of Christ can give them one which will make them rich indeed. It's a nice line, I think, and representative, I think, of who Patrick Henry was. Very serious Christian, a man radically committed to American liberty, uncomfortably so for some of us, because I think it even led him to oppose the Constitution, and certainly a defender of a strong public role for religion in America. He represents, I think, some paths not taken, and that makes him very, very interesting as a founding father. Thank you very much for coming tonight.
We have the opportunity to apply Dr. Kidd with some questions, so I'll let him referee the questions, but I invite you to get your curiosity out on the table for all of our benefit.
And there's a microphone right there if you want to, so people can hear your question.
Yeah, what, this has to do with the Bill of Rights. What role, if any, did Patrick Henry have in the adoption of the Bill of Rights?
I'm glad you asked that. The Anti-Federalists, the people who oppose the Constitution, if you're giving the Anti-Federalists in a nutshell, it's, well, the Anti-Federalists were concerned for a variety of reasons, but mainly they wanted the Bill of Rights, which was not in the original draft of the Constitution. There was no Bill of Rights appended. And Madison and his people didn't originally think it was necessary, and this is, you know, an issue we don't want to get into. But the Anti-Federalists put this pressure on the Federalists and eventually get Madison to make this concession. Okay, if you'll just vote the Constitution in, we'll adopt a Bill of Rights in the first Congress and then send it out to the states. That's fine as far as it goes. And Henry was active in proposing a list of a Bill of Rights at the ratifying convention. But that's not Henry's primary concern. And the reason why is because I think Henry thought, well, so what? Say freedom of speech. But if you give the government the power to violate our freedom of speech, it doesn't matter. It's just window dressing. It's what Madison called Parchment barriers. Who cares? I mean, there's all kinds of tyrannical governments that have beautiful articulated principles, and then they violate them all day long. So what Henry really wanted were structural modifications to the actual powers of the government. For instance, he didn't want the government to have the power to tax. There's some other things that seem more obscure to us about supermajorities for navigation acts and things like this, but I think it's easy to understand something like the issue of taxation. And so when the Bill of Rights, much to Madison's credit, I mean, I'm kind of speaking for the Anti-Federalists tonight, but Madison really should be credited, I think, because not that many people cared about following through on this promise to adopt the Bill of Rights in the first Congress. They've got bigger fish to fry and so forth. But Madison said, no, we've made a promise. We've got to get this adopted. But the Anti-Federalists, the phrase that they used is they said, it's an archaic term. They said, Madison is throwing a tub to the whale. And this, you ever heard this term? It's an old sailor's term back from the colonial period about if you're afraid that your ship is going to get assaulted, Moby Dick-like by a whale, you throw out a tub to distract the whale. And so all this basically means is the Bill of Rights is just a distraction, because what the Anti-Federalists, many of them, really wanted were the structural modifications to the government's power, and they didn't get it. And so, for instance, Henry's friend William Grayson, who's one of the early senators from Virginia, he said that the Bill of Rights is worse than nothing. He says it just doesn't address any of our real concerns. It just sort of says these nice things, but it doesn't adjust the powers of the government at all. So for Henry, it was a real disappointment, not that he expected anything better. Henry's ideal was that the ratification conventions would have had the opportunity to propose real structural modifications that then would have gone to a second convention, and they would have debated it, and then it really would have gone out for a yes or no vote from the states. And if he had gotten that, I think he would have been satisfied, even if he didn't get everything he wanted.
Hello,
yes, sir.
Daniel Broadus, thank you for coming out. You had mentioned that concerning the centralization of the national government and Henry's opposition to it, that if you were in a bad mood here tonight, he might say, I told you so. Now, considering the, we have well over, I think, 200 different denominations, Christian denominations in the United States, and considering the, the religious condition of the United States, we're not biblically literate. When you want to talk about morality and virtue in the United States, it's kind of like whose morality, whose virtue. Do you think that Patrick Henry could see him, could you see him in a bad mood here tonight saying, I told you so, regarding that difference of non-state sanctioned religion versus state sanctioned religion?
Yeah. I think that, as you can tell, I admire Patrick Henry a great deal. I happen to think he's wrong about the issue about direct tax support for churches. And I say this as a Baptist and an evangelical. I think that it is true that just for shorthand that the government tends to mess up anything it gets involved with. And that would certainly be true, I think, of religion. And so when you look at England, of course, still has an official state denomination, the Church of England. They still have that, right? And so when you have this royal wedding, roll out, the Archbishop of Canterbury with, his hat and all this, it has profited them nothing, right, to have this state church. And it's a more complex story than just establishment versus disestablishment. But church attendance in England, is below 5%, maybe more like 2 or 3%, and that's just because of the African immigrants who are living in London and so forth. They're the ones who are bumping up the church numbers. The English people today do not attend church by and large, and yet they give tax support to the Church of England. That hasn't worked out very well for them. So I think that there's an ironic genius of disestablishment. It is the principle in part of the free market, that when people have to compete to reach the people, they do comparatively better. Now, I know that America has all kinds of problems with regard to religion and virtue and morality and all that sort of thing. But in terms of church adherence, it is far, far, far more religious than the nations that supplied, the Anglo and European population of America, many of which kept their state churches. Okay? Now, there's another issue here, though, which is that secularists today have interpreted Jefferson and Madison's position on disestablishment as requiring that we eliminate faith from American public life. The founders did not believe in that. I know David Aikman knows this very well. The founders did not believe in that at all. The closest that you can get, to be fair, is Madison, after his retirement from the presidency, engages in some private speculation about, well, if we're going to have real separation of church and state, maybe we shouldn't have chaplains and things like this. But he's an outlier. Instead, what you see is Jefferson, who is the one who authored this phrase, the wall of separation between church and state, in a letter in 1802 to the Danbury Baptist Association of Connecticut, which are a group of evangelical Baptists who are upset that Connecticut still has a state establishment of religion, the Congregationalist Church. They don't like being forced to support it, or even having to file from exemptions for having to support it. And so they say, President Jefferson, can't you help us with this? President Jefferson says to them, sorry, I'm just the President of the United States. I don't dictate state policy on such matters. How wonderful, just as a side note, how wonderful, a president who recognizes that he has limitations to his powers. And he says the states can continue to have establishments of religion if they want to. The First Amendment doesn't ban that. It only bans Congress from making any law respecting an establishment of religion. But he says this, wall of separation between church and state. On the national level, that's what the First Amendment requires, he says. And then 2 days later, Jefferson hosts a church service in the Congress's chambers with a Baptist evangelical giving the sermon, and Jefferson there sitting in the front row. So what does wall of separation mean to Thomas Jefferson? It could include having church services in the House of Representatives or Senate chambers with the president sitting there in the audience. I don't particularly want this myself. As an evangelical, I don't like the idea of having official church services in Congress. And today we would mess it up and they couldn't pray to Jesus and this sort of thing. But the point is that the great strict separationist of the founding period, right, Thomas Jefferson, doesn't turn out to believe in strict separation of church and state. And so the debate that they're having about an establishment of religion is between whether the state should continue to give direct tax support to churches as churches, which is what about half of the major founders believed, or whether you should get the government out of the business of doing that because the government is incompetent to do that. And that's what the other half of the major founders believed. There is no secularist position among them. And that's, I think, partly why, and I can say these things here and not so much at the National Archives today at lunch, that the secularist position is an ahistorical position. You got me wound up on that one. Thank you. I enjoyed answering that question.
Tom, that was a terrific talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What reservations do you think that Patrick Henry had about the adoption of the federal Constitution have been, in effect, borne out by actual historical developments in the United States?
How much time do I have? He was very concerned that the states would become, that the states would be kind of given the leftovers of political affairs and basically lose their identity. I mean, it's a complex topic, but I think that effectively has happened. Does it happen because of the Constitution? I know that the Constitution opens the possibility. There's a lot longer story there. I mean, the Civil War has something to do with this and developments in the 20th century. And it continues right through the day. The incorporation of the Bill of Rights is applying to the states in various, I mean, it's a long, winding story, and the Constitution doesn't somehow cause this to happen. More controversially, and this may be something that you all would not agree with Henry's view of, but I think he would be very critical of the current status of the American military and the size of it and its ambitions and its use around the world to meddle in the affairs of innumerable issues and nations and sovereign nations who have, now drones flying over them doing all kinds of secret things, and so and basically going. And Henry at the ratification convention said, "I thought we were trying to create a republic, not an empire. What are our ambitions? Are our ambitions to become a great and powerful nation, or is our ambition to protect American liberty?" And he thought that those two goals were at odds. So I think that Henry is a kind of equal opportunity offender, right? I mean, I think that there are things that, the people who like kind of big government, lots of government activism, doing various things on the domestic level, obviously would be offended by things that Henry might say. But I think that people who support, American military exploits around the world too might. I think Henry would be equally horrified. And I said to a couple of you earlier, I mean, people ask me, well, like, what would America be like if we were living in Patrick Henry's America? And I think we might be something like Switzerland or something. Small, not geographically small, but there would be a laser focus on what we need to do is to protect American liberty. And if that's all we do, that's good enough. We don't need to be the greatest nation in terms of power in the world. We just need to protect America's, the citizens' liberties. So I think that, in a nutshell, almost every single thing that the American national government, the federal government, is doing today, Patrick Henry would probably disapprove of, at least in terms of scale.
My name is Emery Grotberg, and I really appreciate you coming out and talking with us tonight.
Thank you.
I was just wondering what inspired you to write about Patrick Henry and study him, and also have you found it to be a rewarding experience? Also, have you come across anything that was surprising about Patrick Henry in your searches?
Yeah. Great, thank you. Patrick Henry shows up in a couple of my earlier books that Dr. Walker mentioned, The Great Awakening, because he's one of the leading Americans who's influenced by the Great Awakening. Also my book, God of Liberty, Religious History of the American Revolution. And so he had been on my radar screen for a while. And so, I have this interest in evangelicalism and the role that faith plays in American history in the 18th century. And so I think he was a kind of obvious next step for me in my writing trajectory to look at Henry's biography. I was also, this is the most political book that I've ever written. This is my entree into more political history, although religion obviously is a major dynamic here. And I'm really interested in Henry as an anti-federalist. A lot of earlier biographies of Henry, there have been quite a number, have tended to say, well, Henry kind of lost his way in the 1780s, and oh well. And I don't see it that way at all. I'm quite sympathetic to the Anti-Federalists, and I think their views made a lot of sense. What was surprising about Patrick Henry? Patrick Henry saved almost none of his own personal papers, and I didn't know that exactly going into it. Some of his descendants made pretty heroic efforts to try to find and save his papers, but he's totally, again, unlike Jefferson on this issue. Jefferson knows that he is a historically important man, right? I mean, and so every single thing that he writes, he saves. because he is historically important. Patrick Henry doesn't have a shred of that attitude in him, and he just thinks he's a regular old guy from Virginia who did a few things in government, and so he doesn't save his own personal papers, including, for instance, the text of the Liberty or Death speech. This is the most famous speech in American history that we do not have the original text of. It's a recreation 40 years later by Henry's first biographer, who interviews people who were there that day, and he says, "What did he say?" And he gets a pretty, consistent message from people, and then this guy applies some of his own artistic license to it, and that's what we've got for the Liberty or Death speech. Sorry, I wish I had more than that, but and so that presents a real quandary for a biographer of Henry, is that how do you tease out, what he said and what he didn't say, what's mythology? I know that if this be treason, make the most of it. I know that that's mythology because we have a reliable first-hand witness of the scene, and he says the opposite of what the legend is. There's no way that this person could mistake what he said. The only first-hand witness says he apologized, and this guy has no dog in the fight. It's a French traveler who just happened to be in the House of Burgesses that day, and he says, well, he kind of apologized. And that's totally different from if this be treason, make the most of it. Okay? And there's other records, recollections that I think are more reliable too. I've never really had to write a book that way that had so much myth-making like there is about many of the Patriots, but with Henry it's a particularly delicate problem because there's so few personal papers. So I had to make a lot of evaluations about, is this true? Could this be true? Should I even mention this? Like the stuff about him defending the Baptists and so forth. All the Baptist histories say, oh yeah, Henry defended the Baptists. Well, there's no paper trail. So should I mention it or not? And I do mention it, but I have to give it with a caveat that there's no actual documentation of this. So sometimes I have to be sort of like a lawyer or a private investigator or something like that, trying to figure out, well, what really happened here? And the documentary record is often much, much more sparse than you would expect it to be.
There's a question right here at the young lady.
Yeah. Thank you for your talk. I had a question, especially as you're talking about the difficulty of finding information on Patrick Henry and the political nature of the book. And you're at the National Archives recently. What has been, if you will, the liberal reaction to this, and or the historians, and what kind of reaction for people who wouldn't be sympathetic with his cause?
Yeah. The book only came out in November, so there hasn't been a ton of reviews of the book that have come out yet. And I can speak more broadly, though, about the kind of reactions that I get to my work. I think that they probably fall into two sorts of camps. The people who know American religious history, well, I'll turn the discussion in part to my doctoral advisor, a man named George Marsden. I know some of you know George Marsden's work, and who is one of the most, he's retired now from Notre Dame, but he was one of the most outspoken advocates of Christian perspectives in higher ed, and including in secular spheres. George Marsden would often get this sort of response where they say, I think this guy is a kook, basically. I think he was actually called a kook in the Chronicle of Higher Education. I think someone actually used that word, right? This guy who wants Christian perspectives in academia. What could he possibly be thinking? He must be insane, right? Such an ideologically freighted kind of idea that you would bring your faith commitments into your academia. This is intolerable, right? But boy, he's a good historian. He sure is a good historian. Nobody can dispute that. So he's crazy, but he's really good. And that's what I always have admired about George Marsden. And this sort of set what my example that I'm trying to get that kind of reaction. I do sometimes get, whether it be in reviews or in comments, on Amazon or something like that, where people say, oh, this is just another one of these evangelicals who's, biased and all this, as if other people aren't biased, right? But I have to say, I think a lot of people really are fair about it. I mean, I try to write in such a way that people can understand what I'm getting at, so that I don't treat Patrick Henry, he's not perfect in this book. I mean, he's a flawed man. I deal at great length about him being a slave owner and his open admission. I actually find this charming. I mean, he says in a remarkable letter in 1774, in effect, he says, I'm just a big hypocrite. What can I say? I can't defend my own slave owning. The only reason I own slaves, he says, is because I can't get by without them economically. There's no justifying what I'm doing. This is a time of great growth and ferment in American liberty and the principles of Christianity, which totally contradict what I'm doing personally, and I make no excuse for myself. I'm a hypocrite. What can I tell you? Now, that only goes so far because he still doesn't do anything about his slaves, right? I mean, he dies a slave owner and then deeds them off to his relatives. So, I mean, he doesn't address the issue, which is kind of frustrating. But I think that would be where critics would say, you're just giving him a pass, right? This is a species of what we call hagiography, the lives of the saints, right? St. Patrick, right, which is what they started calling him in the 1790s. People loved him so much when he was in retirement that the northern newspapers would call him St. Patrick. In my book, he's not St. Patrick. He's a very, very admirable man who has flaws, just like we all do. And, we have to realize that, if you were born in a slave-owning family in the South in 1776, 99% chance you would have died as a slave owner. I don't know if you ever thought about that. I mean, if you sit there and think, these slave owners, right? If you had grown up in that culture, you would have believed in slavery and you would have been a slave owner yourself, right? I mean, we have to kind of be humble about these things. But because I don't try to cover those things up, I think people probably tend to take me a little more seriously. And I think that that's a danger of the sort of what you can call for shorthand the sort of Christian America type history of the founding, which is they're all traditional Christians, they're all perfect, none of them made mistakes. Even Jefferson is a traditional believer, right? Even Franklin, who calls himself a deist, is a traditional Christian, right? I mean, these are mistakes, right? Christians should not indulge this sort of thing. And it gets very close in some cases to just not telling the truth. And that's when secular critics really get wound up, when they feel like you're not calling it like it is. I find that most of the people that I get the feeling that they've actually read the book, they don't respond that way to my stuff. And it may be partly, I'm writing for a secular press, a well-regarded secular trade press, New York City. The people I work with at my press are not Christians, right? I think that helps me to have more credibility, with secular reviewers too. Not that it's great to work for Christian presses too. It's just a trade-off, there's good and bad with both scenarios.
Let's draw to a close here. I just want to comment that here at Patrick Henry College, we are trying to be faithful to our namesake, to his virtues, and hopefully not his vices. And as to his nemesis, Thomas Jefferson, let's just say that here in Purcellville, we're trying to get right what Thomas Jefferson got wrong down there in Charlottesville. And let's also congratulate Dr. Kidd on being an excellent historian, and not in any way a kook.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it. I know that they have some books, copies of the Patrick Henry book for sale over there, and I see some of you have copies of it, so if you wanted me to sign it, I certainly would indulge that, or if you have other questions you want to ask me personally, that'd be fine too. I'll hang around for a while. Okay, thank you.